1990, General Motors Dustbuster minivans. You've already read how two Japanese powerhouses failed to compete with Chrysler's minivans. Did you expect GM to do any better? To be fair to GM, its early 1990 efforts got the interior size about right, but everything else about the Chevrolet Lumina APV, Oldsmobile Silhouette, and Pontiac Transport was wrong. The design was supposed to be futuristic. Instead, they earned the nickname Dustbuster after the handheld vacuum cleaner they so closely resembled. It's hard to tell which of the three versions was the ugliest. The Transport, with its grooved plastic cladding tacked onto the Dustbuster's plastic body, gets our vote. But hideous styling was far from these vans' worst aspect. The 120 horsepower 3.1-liter V6 left them woefully underpowered. The mile-long dashboard made them disorienting to drive, and the anti-aider nose made them a pain to park. GM spent years patching up these odes to poor decision-making with bigger engines, shorter noses, and modified dashboards, but to no avail. All three versions remained failures in the marketplace, leading to their rarity today. 1991 Saturn S Series. Saturn wasn't just one of the worst cars of the 1990s, it was one of the worst car companies. Brainchild of Call Me Roger Smith, now remembered as the worst CEO in General Motors history, the Saturn division advertised itself as a different kind of car company. Unfortunately, its first product, the 1991 S-Series, wasn't a different kind of car. Despite unique powertrains and engineering, it felt no different than GM's other front-wheel drive heaps of that era. Noisy, unrefined, indifferently engineered, and meh to drive, with build quality that was better than typical for GM but still not up to Honda standards. Saturn's innovative and expensive plastic body panels were supposed to enable frequent styling changes, but that never happened because there was no money left to change the styling. Saturn's all-new cars, factories, dealerships, and workforce drained GM's corporate coffers of some $5 billion, dooming not only the S-Series but most of General Motors' product lines to a decade of mediocrity. 1996 Nissan 200 SXS-ER. To understand how lousy the 200 SXS-ER was, you have to know how awesome its predecessor, the 1991-94 Sentra SER, was. Every car magazine raved about that 140 horsepower, 2,400-pound under-the-radar missile. In 1995, Nissan replaced the two-door Sentra with the swoopy but bland 200 SX, and we waited eagerly for the SER version, only to wish we'd never seen it. The Sentra SER's independent rear end was gone, replaced by a cheaper torsion beam, and although the powertrain was a carryover, the 200 SX's extra weight and bulk slowed the 0 to 60 time by almost half a second. The suspension was softened in the name of the two most dreaded words in the automotive business, increased compliance. And although Motor Trend's instrumented testing showed the 200 SXS-ER to have skid pad and slalom numbers superior to those of its predecessor, the magic that made the Sentra SER so endearing was gone. Why is the brilliant Sentra SER not more fondly remembered? Probably because the 200 SXS-ER was terrible enough to ruin the SER moniker for good. 1991 Toyota Previa. It seems rather ironic that Japanese companies could literally reshape what Americans wanted from their cars, yet creating a vehicle that could compete with Chrysler's blockbuster minivans was a seemingly simple task that continued to elude them. Witness the Previa, an egg-shaped oddity that came to market and immediately alienated most would-be buyers with its high price and pregnant guppy styling. Those who did make it as far as a test drive had another unpleasant surprise waiting. While most minivans had V6 power, the Previa was powered by a hopelessly overtaxed four-cylinder engine. We timed an all-wheel drive 1990 Previa all-track to 60 miles per hour in an excruciating 13.6 seconds, and EPA fuel economy estimates were barely out of the high teens. The Previa's mid-engine platform had no room for a six-cylinder engine, so Toyota added a supercharger, which only succeeded in making the Previa slightly quicker and significantly noisier. It took Toyota the better part of the decade to figure out that the only way to compete with the Chrysler vans was to clone them, which it did with the 1998 Sienna. 1995 Chevrolet Monte Carlo. The Monte Carlo had a 2-decade run as the car of choice for gas station Casanovas before quietly being laid to rest in 1988. 7 years later, Chevrolet destroyed the dead Monte Carlo's dignity by attaching its storied moniker to this rolling travesty, which was actually the 2-door version of the new second-generation Lumina. The problem was that Monte Carlos were known for their distinctive style, but the 1995 version literally had none. It was the epitome of the anonymous wheeled blob. From Maine to Oregon, grown men with mullets threw down their half-smoked Winstons in disgust and burst into tears. Even the supposedly sporty Z34 version managed to bleach out any personality that might have carried over from its predecessor, the passably credible Lumina Z34. Liberally slathered with the appalling mediocrity that was the hallmark of mid-90s General Motors, the Monte Carlo literally had no redeeming features beyond its ability to impart seats with motion. Amazingly, Chevrolet made no effort to address the Monte Carlo's anonymity until replacing it with a new version for Y2K, a car that was as ugly could be, but at least had some personality. 1995 Honda Odyssey. It wasn't just Toyota that got tripped up in its efforts to build a decent minivan. Honda got it wrong as well. A conservative company, Honda waited a full decade before going up against Chrysler's unassailable vans. Time you'd think the company could have used to thoroughly assess failed attempts like the aforementioned Previa, weird and slow, the Nissan Quest, too small, and the Mazda MPV, just plain wrong. Nope. Honda repeated many of its competitors' mistakes and made a few of its own, most notably eschewing the sliding doors so beloved by parents in favor of traditional hinged doors. Worse yet, this undersized oddity arrived just before Chrysler released a bigger and better version of its minivan, which proceeded to outsell the Honda Odyssey by a ratio of roughly 25-1. Honda flogged some to Isuzu, rebadged as the Oasis, and in return, Honda got the poorly built Rodeo to sell as the Honda Passport. It's difficult to determine which company got the worse end of that deal. If the Odyssey did anything well, it was proving that those who thought Honda could do no wrong were wrong. 1992 AM General Hummer H1. America's success in Operation Desert Storm turned soldiers into rock stars, leading to popular demand for AM General to build a civilian version of its military high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicle. But Hummer H1 buyers soon discovered why the military offers such good benefits: to make up for the misery of driving around in a Humvee. Despite being as wide as the Panama Canal, the H1 offered next to no passenger space, primarily because its hapless occupants had to share the cabin with the engine. That engine was GM's utterly wretched 6.2-liter naturally aspirated diesel, which made up for its stupendous lack of power with an overexuberance of noise. Though, to be fair, it fought an exuberant battle trying to outshout the H1's moaning driveline and roaring tires. AM General tried to address the noise problem by fitting a gas engine, Chevy's venerable 5.7-liter V8, which only succeeded in making the painfully slow H1 even slower. When GM bought the Hummer brand, it figured out that the best way to sell Hummers to civilians was to spin them from civilian vehicles like the Suburban and Tahoe, hence the runaway success of the H2. 1995 BMW 318. Somehow BMW's American organization got it into its corporate head that it needed to capture its young up-and-coming customers at an even younger age, so it imported the 3 Series Compact as its entry-level model. Hitting the self-imposed $20,000 target price, about $36,000 in 2024, meant using a small 1.8-liter engine and ditching the E46's multi-link rear suspension for the old E30's trailing arms. And if you think this sounds like a bad idea, you should drive the car. The 318T couldn't even keep up with a Dodge Neon. Not the SRT4, but the ordinary Neon, which was more than a second quicker to 60 and cost half as much. Handling was fine, one of the few expectations the 318 met. But the ride felt as if the front and rear suspensions came from completely different cars, because they did. The silly styling, same wheelbase as the 3 sedan with a body shortened by 9 inches, apparently with a sawzall, did it no favors. It took 4 years and a pitiful 25,000 sales for BMW to realize that a slow, ugly, ill-riding car did nothing for its brand image, no matter how cheap the pricing. 1991 Mercury Capri. Ford decided it needed a competitor for the MX-5 Miata, but instead of working with Mazda, a company that Ford partially owned, Dearborn cobbled together this wheeled mishap from parts bins all over the world. The car was based on the Australian market Ford Laser, which, ironically, was a reskinned Mazda 323 hatchback. The Capri was, poorly, assembled in Australia, and despite being marketed to young women, sold at old-man brand Lincoln Mercury dealerships. Rather than follow what they knew about such vehicles, Ford execs went shoulder-deep into customer clinics, which convinced them that the most important attributes in a convertible sports car were comfort and practicality. That explains why, unlike the Miata, the Capri had front-wheel drive and a vestigial back seat. It also explains why, unlike the Miata, no one bought the Capri. We've always thought the car's name was misspelled. Move the R between the C and the A, and you get a much more suitable moniker. 1993 Volkswagen Eurovan. Volkswagen, having given America its first minivan in the form of the famed Transporter, probably figured it knew a thing or two about how to compete against Chrysler's all-conquering minivans. Volkswagen was wrong. The Eurovan was little more than a glossed-over commercial truck, and as a minivan it was too big, too heavy, and way the hell too slow. Its 2.5-liter 5-cylinder engine mustered a mere 109 horsepower and 140 pound-feet of torque, and given the deadly combination of a steep hill and a stiff headwind, it felt like it might lose the battle to keep the nearly 2-ton Eurovan moving. Granted, VW had no problem selling slow vans to stoned hippies in the 1960s, but now that the me generation had traded their weed and tie-dyes for kids and IRAs, they demanded something better. Sales were so dismal that VW pulled the Eurovan after just 1 year. The Eurovan returned in 1999 with 6-cylinder power, but buyers were no more receptive. Compared to other minivans, even lousy efforts like the aforementioned Previa and first-gen Odyssey, the Eurovan's pitiful sales numbers looked like a rounding error. 1994 Ford Aspire. The Mazda-designed, Kia-built Ford Festiva was a runaway success in the late 1980s and early 90s, so when time came for a replacement, Ford and Kia figured they knew what they were doing. Instead of going back to Mazda, these two unlikely partners took it upon themselves to cobble together a bigger and more bulbous car using the same mechanical bits. The resulting Aspire drove as if it had been designed by first-year engineering students. The unassisted steering was slow and heavy, grip was lousy, body roll was outright comical, and refinement was non-existent. And this was just at city speeds, which was about all the Festiva's carryover 1.3-liter engine could muster for the bigger, heavier Aspire. Its interior was just as dire as that of its chief rival, the eternally dismal Geo Metro. But the Geo delivered better fuel economy and was, brace yourselves for 3 words we never thought we'd use to describe a Metro, better to drive. A quick test drive of the Aspire convinced most would-be buyers that they could aspire to something better, like taking the bus. 1990 Yugo Cabrio. This entry may seem unfair, as we've already roasted the dastardly Yugo hatchback on our list of the worst cars of the 1980s, but it seems that with the introduction of the new for 1990 Yugo convertible, those evil geniuses at Zastava found ways to make the awful Yugo even more miserable for us greedy capitalist pigs. Instead of the simple manual top you'd expect on America's cheapest convertible, Yugo fitted a complex electro-hydraulic mechanism, one more thing to break on a car famous for braking. And although hardtop Yugos were finally fitted with fuel injection in 1990, the Cabrio made do with the old emissions-choked and impossible-to-tune feedback carburetor. Why? Because F you, American sun worshippers. If the goal of the Yugo's designers was to prove that the hardtop Yugo wasn't the turdiest car ever made, well, mission accomplished. American buyers, having been once bitten by the Yugo, took home fewer than 100 of these drop-top disasters before the Yugo organization imploded in 1992. Oh, and if you're wondering why the Geo Metro convertible isn't on this list, it's because compared to the Yugo, that rolling calamity is practically a Bentley. 1996 Suzuki X90. More than a quarter century has elapsed since we first scratched our heads trying to figure out what the hell, or why the hell, the Suzuki X90 was, and we've yet to receive an even passively plausible suggestion. Based on the popular Suzuki Sidekick, the underpowered X90 had optional four-wheel drive, but its passenger car tires and ankle-high ground clearance rendered it useless on anything more severe than a well-tended lawn. The X90 was also devoid of utility, having no back seat and a miserly trunk with barely enough room for the removable T-tops. Yep, that's right. This car of the 90s had the roof of the 70s, so it wasn't even a passable convertible. The exterior design looked like it was penned by a 4-year-old, while the cheap plastic dash inside clashed with the Crayola vomit upholstery. Suzuki polluted every car magazine with hyper-annoying X90 ads featuring eye-zapping red and yellow spirals and a headline that shouted, "What are you staring at?" To which we shouted back, "A stupid, pointless SUV that no one will buy." And we were right. Suzuki moved just 7,000 examples of this exercise in futility over a 3-year model run, which, by the way, was precisely 3 years too long. No question, in a decade that gave us plenty of bad cars, the Suzuki X90 is absolutely the worst car of the 1990s.